Welcome to Women Igniting Change, the place to be for women leaders and decision makers who are passionate about changing the world and determined to act. I'm your host, Robin Jorgensen, former corporate executive, global speaker, and founder and CEO of Women Igniting Change. Let's dive in. Hey, changemakers, welcome back to the Women Igniting Change podcast. With everything going on in the US right now, I wanted to bring an episode from season 2 back to the forefront. The issue of reproductive rights is multifaceted, and this episode does an excellent job of clarifying the differences between reproductive rights, reproductive health, and reproductive justice, respectively. It also continues reiterating that since the fall of Roe 2 years ago here in the US, the consequences of denying women their reproductive rights are dire, and they affect everyone in ways they often don't realize. The more informed we all are around this issue, the more we can advocate and take a stand. So please take a listen, and we'll see you back here next week. Hello, changemakers. Welcome back to the Women Igniting Change podcast. Today in the studio, we have two incredible guests, Pari and Eve. As global public health professionals, both of these amazing women are sexual and reproductive rights advocates who have worked all over the world championing these rights for women and girls. And today we're going to dive into a much needed conversation around the intersectionality of sexual and reproductive health and equitable and participatory approaches. Pari, Eve, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
I'm so excited to dive into this topic, especially the three of us living here in the US, because this is a really, really needed conversation. Both of you have extensive backgrounds in sexual and reproductive health and diverse experiences across continents and across contexts. Share a specific moment or experience from your career that really impacted your perspective on sexual and reproductive health and how it's influenced your work.
Yeah, sure. I can share first. I have a pretty clear moment for me. So when I was 25, I moved to Morocco to teach English in these after-school youth programs. However, my company placed me in such a remote location that the community didn't really need English because they never left the village. They never moved out. This was like very normal for them.
Right.
So I had to reinvent my job, and I did so by basically doing what I now realize was a community needs assessment. So I asked the local women who were my neighbors how I could support them. And they said there was no gym in town. So there was one, but it was really only for men. They had no way to work out. And could I teach them aerobics? I, at the time, had absolutely zero experience teaching fitness classes. But I asked someone in the US to send me some Jillian Michaels DVDs. She was really hot at the time. And before I knew it, I was teaching weekly cardio classes. But what happened next is what really changed my life and pivoted my career. As the women in my cardio classes began to trust me, they started bringing health questions to me. And at first it was just about working out. But then it moved to, managing weight and what to do if they had cramps in class. Or at one point, one girl said she couldn't work out because she was on her period. Mm-hmm. And when I would ask for more context around their questions, I realized that they really had no information on how their own bodies worked. Wow. They learned basic biology and anatomy in school, but they had no health education classes growing up. So the girls were taught by their mothers that they would just get sick every month because they were girls, and that during that time they couldn't do anything. Sometimes they wouldn't even go to school. And that made me realize how much I took for granted the privilege of the knowledge I had about my own body, and that wasn't afforded to all women everywhere. And that's basically what propelled me into a career in not just public health, but sexual and reproductive health.
Yeah. Pari, how about you?
Yeah, ironically for me, it was the other way around. I mean, I don't think I had one defining moment, but it definitely had a lot to do with moving to the United States. That actually solidified it for me. So I think it was a combination of, growing up and understanding what it means to be a woman, and then especially being a woman in a space where you're not necessarily allowed to take up the kind of space that you deserve to, and also don't have access that I used to back home, and so on. So for me, it was a gradual building and a recognition that even though women experience unique health challenges, unique life experiences, they aren't really encouraged to talk amongst themselves. They aren't, a lot of us don't even know ourselves well enough because we're disencouraged from doing that.
Mhm.
There isn't discourse around these kinds of things that's normalized. And so it was a very like, there was one moment where I was like, okay, this might be an area of professional interest, and then every experience after that just made that grow and grow and grow, and made me be like, okay, this is truly an area that I could be passionate about forever. And so when Eve and I met, it was just sort of a culmination and amalgamation of several different experiences coming together and identifying that this is an arena where genuine change needs to be made for women
Mhm.
to be able to truly self-actualize to their full potential.
Yeah. So reproductive rights, often intersects with complex social, cultural, and political dynamics, especially here in the US. Describe a challenging situation you encountered working in the field and how you navigated that to achieve a positive outcome.
Yeah, I mean, a significant ongoing challenge that our whole industry is dealing with is just the ever-changing political environment that we're operating in. Unfortunately, we have arrived in the US back at a time in which women's bodily autonomy and our ability to control our own choices is, in fact, not up to us, but instead up to politicians, many of whom are woefully uneducated and uninformed about reproductive health and rights. And, removing the right to medical privacy, which is what the Dobbs decision did a year and a half ago, or getting rid of federal protections related to abortion has some obvious consequences. For example, people's ability to access healthcare is reduced, the capacity of doctors to do their jobs is reduced. Social systems are now going to be seeing a lot more unplanned, unwanted pregnancies that they're going to have to protect and account for. And ultimately, of course, maternal mortality rates are going to skyrocket. But what I think is a less obvious but still very intentional consequence of this constantly shifting legal and political environment is that it's now even tougher for the average person to know what their rights are, especially considering that it's different by state and by gestational age and by circumstance. And even I see this uncertainty and confusion manifest in a lot of different ways that makes our work more challenging.
Yeah. And I would also add that all of this is further compounded by our legislators and just really the general public not fully understanding the distinction between reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice. So those are three complementary but very distinct frameworks that each make up different pieces of the reproductive puzzle, where reproductive health deals with service delivery, reproductive rights addresses the legal aspects of issues, and reproductive justice focuses on movement building and social equity. So our work is primarily focused on reproductive rights, which we progress, as you know, through our TikTok channel, through some consulting work via education, advocacy, and
Right.
partnership building.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
unpacking the definition of those three because I do think we conflate those three together often.
Mhm.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
thank you.
and you'd asked Robin how we navigate this challenge. And frankly, an ongoing challenge requires an ongoing solution. And that was exactly the impetus for Eve and I to start our Gemma Talk social media channels. It
Yeah.
was, it was June of 2022. The Supreme Court had just dismantled Roe. And Eve and I were feeling all of the feels that came with that massive shift in women's rights. And we knew we wanted to do something about it. We'd both been working in the field of sexual and reproductive health for over a decade each, and we basically just started thinking through all of the implications that the SCOTUS decision was going to have on the American public. And knowing what we knew, we wanted to figure out what gaps existed that we could help fill, while also honoring the incredible organizations and groups that are already doing the health and justice work.
Right.
So we did our research, and it showed us that a majority of Americans under the age of 30 consider social media to be a legitimate source of news and health information,
Right.
which in itself is, I think, a different kind of info epidemic that needs to be addressed. But despite that, the lean of the American public, there's most pro-choice organizations have very limited social media presence, especially on TikTok. So even I decided that this is the way in which we could contribute, and we decided to start our own channels. And our goal has been to provide education and awareness building on reproductive health and rights in real time, using actual data and evidence as a way of combating all of the misinformation and disinformation that exists on the internet. We wanted to instead serve as a safe and legitimate source of health information which can unfortunately be a rarity.
Yeah. You've talked about trying to like normalize this, and you've made that a central theme in your work. How do you see public health and advocacy playing a role in shifting those societal norms and attitudes that we talked about?
I'm glad you asked about advocacy because that's really critical in this work, not just in public health, but just across many sectors because it helps people become involved in the decisions that are affecting them. American women have, as we know, have experienced a lot of setbacks in recent years. Over the course of time, we have advanced when you think back decades or a century, but in recent memory, things have not been so great. And frankly, women are tired. We're tired. Advocacy work is important because it helps reignite people's energy. It makes them remember their voice again and that they have something to fight for. When you add in the public health lens, it really highlights that nothing exists in a vacuum. Every health issue intersects with race, with income, with
Right.
environment, just to name a few. And public health makes it clear that women's issues aren't just women's issues, they affect everybody. Removing healthcare access for half of the US population affects everybody. Nobody likes to be sick. The US economy can't afford to have women out of work. No one likes to not be able to get care when they need it. So, combining public health and advocacy helps people understand that reproductive issues that they didn't originally think may have applied to them really do.
When we think about what advocacy looks like on social media specifically, it's, alluding to what Eve said, it's taking what people might think is a singular issue, like abortion, and showing them how in reality abortion is connected to everything else, like human
Right.
rights, capitalism, race, climate change, even civil society. I think often what people don't realize about the new social media, like TikTok or X, if I can even call them new, is that these platforms are facilitating conversations in ways that social media previously has not. And traditionally, when people think about advocacy, they picture lobbying or legislative advocacy. And
Mhm.
of course, that very much still exists. But social media has additionally created a space for a new kind of educational advocacy and almost like what we call vigilante activism, is a severely untapped space. And what's more is that the users are the next generation of voters, lawmakers, politicians,
Right.
doctors, advocates themselves. And we are currently being able to interact with them and share information and advocacy messages that we hope will help influence this new generation to get involved with these issues early on and also forever.
Yeah. Talk a little bit more about the power of collective action and advancing reproductive rights. So, Eve, to your point, we as women in the US feel like, well, not feel like our rights have been taken away and we feel like we've lost control, we've lost power. What is the impact of collective action of us all coming together around this issue?
Yeah, I think collective action is ultimately the one organizing element that could change public opinion on something, right? And we've
Yeah.
seen groups do this. Even I, while we've been working in the reproductive health space and are newer to the rights and advocacy space, there are a lot of organizations and especially reproductive justice groups that are led by women of color around the country that have been on the ground and advocating for this for decades now. They saw the fall of Roe coming from a mile away and have been preparing for it. I think it's just that the rest of the American public saw it as a shock, but the people who have been in this arena knew that it was about to happen. And so we're collectively organizing around this for a long time. And one example of a piece of collective action that Eve and I are pretty proud of being semi involved with is in 2019, folks within the city of Atlanta forecasted that the state of Georgia was about to make some, in the years to come, about to make some very conservative decisions around women's reproductive rights.
Hmm.
And so there was a group that got together called Amplify in 2019 that I was contributing to that brought together organizers from across the reproductive justice space to essentially lobby the city of Atlanta to make the city what's it called a designated safe space for reproductive health. And it took about 9 months from start to finish, which is ironic in itself. um,
True.
to get the city legislators to, first co-sign draft legislation around making the city this way, and then get the full yes from the board that was involved in this. And ultimately, what happened is that the city councilors all signed on to this, and now the city of Atlanta is considered a designated safe space for reproductive health. And then a few weeks later, the city took it a step further, and they actually recognized Abortion Providers Appreciation Day, which is March 10th across the country, but only recognized by certain states. And then the following year, what happened is, as we all know, COVID happened in 2020, and then the fall of Roe came soon after that. But because they had done that work with the city of Atlanta, and even though Georgia as a state was one of the more conservative responses, uh, the city of Atlanta was prepared to then put city dollars towards protection of reproductive health access within the city limits, which might not seem like a significant change if you're operating within state law, but it is still a recognition that there's collective work happening to try and protect rights within the confines of a law that exists. And that's just one of many examples that's taken place across the US of fighters, essentially, like just like justice fighters coming together and doing all of this heavy work to protect the lives and access of women that they haven't even met yet.
Right.
And I think that that's a really valuable and wonderful thing that often goes unnoticed and unrecognized.
Yeah. Let's dive into talking about the healthcare ecosystem for a minute. So, you're both passionate about building a vibrant sexual and reproductive healthcare ecosystem. That's a significant part of your work. Elaborate on how that type of ecosystem contributes to more equity and more of a just approach to reproductive health.
Sure, I can start. I want to go back to the three frameworks that I mentioned in the beginning, the
Yeah.
reproductive health, rights, and justice. So, mirroring these frameworks, the sexual and reproductive health ecosystem includes everyone from health service providers to funders to advocacy groups, civil society organizations, and social movements. There's a lot of people in this ecosystem, and I'll give an example specific to how this applies on the issue of abortion.
Sure.
Generally, the abortion ecosystem is made up of the providers, as in the OBGYNs and clinics that provide the health services, the abortion funds, so the organizations that help people pay for their care, practical support networks. So these are organizations that help people navigate the logistics around getting care, like transportation, like lodging. And then there's C4 advocacy groups. So these are the ones that organize and activate around legislation and legal protections. Right now, because of the state specific laws in the US, the abortion ecosystem can look different state to state. And in some cases, it's even moving to a regional model where we aren't just talking about interstate SRH ecosystems, but intrastate ecosystems and even national systems when we start to think about larger US-based abortion entities like the National Abortion Federation, NAF, and the National Network of Abortion Funds, which is NNAF.
The ecosystems that these organizations and groups together create are really critical. It kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, that it's not a stretch to say that these groups have cushioned people from the full impact of the fall of Roe, especially in conservative states. And here's what I mean by that. For example, all of the red states implement a set of policies known as TRAP laws. TRAP stands for Targeted Regulation of Abortion Providers. And TRAP laws make it so that someone seeking abortion care has to undergo a series of requirements, such as a mandatory ultrasound, a counseling session, a 24-hour wait period, and so on. It also mandates several requirements on the actual clinics and the providers, but for now, I'll keep it a high level to the client experience instead. So let's say you have someone in Texas who needs an abortion, but it's not available there. And so now she has to travel outside of the state in order to get care. That means she is potentially needing to take time off work, find childcare for her existing children, have a means of transportation to get to where she's going, have the financial means to afford an out-of-state trip, and also at least a 24-hour stay wherever she's going. And for a lot of people in the US, those conditions render it essentially impossible for them to get care until the ecosystem steps in. So Eve mentioned abortion funds and practical support networks. These are groups that will help people pay for abortion costs or pay and find coverage for other logistical pieces like the physical travel or lodging for the 24-hour wait period and so on. The ecosystem is what makes it possible again for people to get care who would have otherwise completely been excluded.
But I want to make sure we answer the question about the challenges. So to summarize all of that, I would say the two biggest challenges to the ecosystem are the shifting political landscape that we've seen since the fall of Roe, but also the intense reliance on donor support to facilitate this continued access to care. So many of the organizations within the reproductive health ecosystem in the US are working really, really hard and getting very creative to kind of circumvent these issues. But for long-term sustainability, it's going to require more public support towards the issues than like specific donors and kind of just playing defense of reacting to all of the legislation that's preventing care.
Yeah. So that kind of lends itself into the next question of social accountability. So, can you provide an example of a project or an initiative that effectively leveraged social accountability to address sexual and reproductive health challenges? And what lessons can we learn from that?
Yeah, social accountability is so important. I mean, in regular reproductive health programming, social accountability tools are exceptionally useful for driving civic engagement, building relationships between community members and duty bearers, and facilitating the creation of action plans and generating collective responsibility.
Yeah,
Um,
that's like the traditional piece of it, though. And so
Mhm.
it's interesting because that looks a lot different for us on social media, and social accountability means something different on social media. So when we're looking at it from that aspect, our challenge is that the audience is constantly shifting because people can just choose to stop interacting with the content whenever we want, whenever they want. Unlike with traditional social accountability activities where there's formal programming that target specific communities and duty bearers. On social media, really anybody can be a part of your audience. It's a lot less targeted and is just entirely reliant on who the algorithm rolls out your content to. So some of the ways that we've been trying to apply principles of social accountability to our channels are sharing, relevant news and information promptly so folks know what's going on in the US reproductive health space as it's happening, providing real-time updates with ongoing legal cases. So most recently we did several posts on, Brittany Watts and the Kate Cox cases. We actively respond to comments to try to engage the more reasonable arguments that people make in open dialogue. And as you can imagine, there's kind of a whole range of responses that we get, but we do try to engage the ones where people are genuinely curious and asking questions and trying to like voice their concerns in a public forum so we can honor it as a discussion space for them. We also will, we showcase data and evidence from reliable sources. A lot of the public doesn't have time to sit down and read scientific journal articles. So we summarize these in bite-sized pieces and then link back to these sources for people to learn more. So essentially we, from a social accountability lens, we use our accounts to inform the public and equip them with information that they can then use to take action with the people holding responsibility, like our lawmakers, either in the voting booth or calling their representatives to demand change, or perhaps one day our long-term goal, having women run for office.
So let's dive into Eve. You mentioned policymakers, and we talked about advocacy. From your experiences, what strategies have proven effective in communicating the importance of this to people that have opposing views and diverse views?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, advocacy on social media is made additionally complicated by the fact that your audience can be absolutely anyone.
Right.
Normally, advocacy is targeted, but on social media, there isn't a baseline for someone's awareness of an issue or level of engagement or even level of investment, and frankly even education level. Like you have to design your messages in a way that speak to a broad depth of comfort with that issue. And of course, even I am building a follower base that is aligned with our interests, but the social media algorithms are such that anyone can see or receive your content. And of course, that's a double-edged sword because it helps you grow, but it can also have you receive opposition in a way that you've never received in real life spaces.
Yeah. I would say that a big part of our strategy is recognizing that people don't want to be judged for their views. And that goes for, either side of the political spectrum or wherever you're coming from. So if folks are already decided on where they stand on sexual and reproductive health issues, they are immediately on the defense when they talk to somebody that they feel is on the other side of the fence. So we usually don't engage those folks who are on extreme ends because they're always the loudest and they, quite frankly, don't usually want to learn. We try to reach the folks who are unsure. And I will say there's a lot of people in the US who are unsure where they stand on repro health issues. I mean, there are a lot of people who are very supportive. We know that support for access to abortion care can be, as high as 70-80% in public opinion polls. But there's a lot of people who still sit in the middle because they don't have time to think about it every day. They have to think about their daily lives, getting their kids to school, going to work, and something like abortion or access to contraception doesn't affect them every day. And so a lot of our posts try to cater to that lens of like meeting people where they are. You have to bring the reality of reproductive health access to them. And I can give a personal example. A lot of my friends who are, in their early, mid, late 30s are wanting to start families, and that is great. One thing that a lot of people don't think about, though, is how abortion bans make it more dangerous for women who genuinely want to get pregnant. So some of my friends who very much want a baby are scared to get pregnant because if anything goes wrong, their life may be at risk depending on their zip code, depending on where they live, because either they won't be able to access care because of, abortion bans, or their local maternity wards have been shut down because OBGYNs are leaving restrictive states to practice elsewhere because they don't want to deal with the liability of these restrictions. And so we're seeing OBGYNs, kind of understandably fleeing these restrictive states, and then there's less maternity care there. So for my friends, these stakes are just too great, and it's seriously influencing when and how many children they want to have. So, like using that example, you have to speak on rights issues in terms of how it affects people every day rather than this abstract. Statistics are great, but when people hear like 1 of 3 women will have an abortion in their lifetime, they know it sounds high, but it never seems like it's actually going to affect or happen to them. Yeah.
And I think that's part of our advocacy goal is that also, what Eve was sharing is that a lot of women don't understand that with the new abortion bans, even having a miscarriage will put you at risk of sort of legal punishment, which of course is crazy. But from a medical perspective, there isn't a difference between a miscarriage and an abortion. And I don't think people understand that. Like even a certified OBGYN provider, if they were giving you a physical checkup after you'd experienced a miscarriage, they wouldn't be able to differentiate whether you had had a miscarriage or an abortion. And I think people don't understand that. And so our part of our advocacy goal is to say that, reproductive health includes so much more than just abortion. And yet when people hear reproductive health, that's all they think about because it's been so politicized and inflammatory. And earlier Eve had mentioned that the 3 frameworks of health, rights, and justice and how they interact. And part of our strategy is to try and communicate those frameworks to diverse audiences, and talking about the multitude of things that are part of that. So, for example, it's not just about having control over your body in relation to your reproductive choices, but all of your choices. So it's about whether to have children, when to have children, how to parent any future children, where to live, what kind of job to have. It's all of autonomy is not exclusive from one another. And in our work, even I have met so many women who had to navigate the medical system or self-advocate for years and years before they were even able to get a diagnosis or a treatment for sexual and reproductive health issues that had nothing to do with abortion, like for example endometriosis or PCOS, just because women's healthcare is so poorly understood by most people.
Yeah. We've talked about reproductive health. It's a personal issue, and it's also a very stigmatized topic. So how do we foster open and constructive conversations within communities to break down those barriers
Mm-hmm.
and promote reproductive rights without perpetuating stereotypes or biases? How do we do that?
I would say the number one thing is to just talk about what happens in women's healthcare. And like literally any woman in America or otherwise can do that. So talk about abortion openly as you're comfortable, talking about IUD insertion, talking about women's pain management when it comes to, gynecological procedures and your needs. Talk about these things with your close friends, with your families, with your communities, because most change starts at the ground level. And the more that we openly discuss and normalize these topics, the more that we realize how many people it actually affects in the country, but also in our immediate circles, which kind of has the most influencing change when you realize that people that you love, the people surrounding you are affected by a particular issue. It then leads to cries for change and cries for justice.
Yeah, this is a really hard thing to talk about, but one in every four women in the United States will be raped during her lifetime, and one of every three will have an abortion. 20% of women will have a miscarriage, and like all of these and so many other things are sexual and reproductive health issues, and yet people almost never talk about them. Like the national data is so alarming and yet unknown that when even I share it on social media, people call us liars because they're like, there's no way that's possible, even though this is all publicly available data by the CDC. And I bring this up to point out how many of us and our sisters and our mothers and our friends have likely experienced some type of reproductive health trauma, but we're also all simultaneously still so lonely in the process because it's not normal to talk about it.
Mhm.
And the stigma that this silence carries is so incredibly damaging because it reinforces this idea that women are somehow responsible for our own suffering. And what Eve and I have been trying to do through our work is create community for women to be able to find, camaraderie and comfort in a space, the internet, that can otherwise be quite corrosive. And we have, since we started doing this, received hundreds of messages from women, maybe even thousands, just offering up their stories and sharing intimate life details with us because they don't have the safe space to do that within their own circles. And I would, we're strangers to them. They don't necessarily know us, but they still feel like we are a safer space than what they know in real life because we are actually just talking about things. So I would say, as far as our advocacy goals, even I initially set out with the goal of education, and it's grown into so much more than that. And our hope now is that we can continue to foster normalcy around these topics so that more and more people can openly discuss them.
Yeah. So as leaders in this field, what advice would you give to emerging public health professionals who are passionate about reproductive health and they really want to make a meaningful difference and impact in their careers? What advice do you have for them?
So Pari and I have had some discussions about this because, as you can imagine, as part of our social media work, we do have people commenting, I'm going into public health, I'm going into reproductive health. Like
Help.
what should I do? And I'm not going to lie, this is a hard time to enter the sexual and reproductive health field. And I'm going to say something that might sound intimidating, but I'm going to follow it up with a positive. So a career in sexual and reproductive health, like people should know up front that it's not for the faint of heart. It takes a lot of self-care. It takes a lot of interrogation of your personal beliefs because you will be asked to defend these beliefs all the time. In the US context, we've experienced a lot of setbacks, but when you get out of the US bubble and look at the rest of the world, we see many countries that are moving forward in their fight for reproductive rights. So Colombia, Argentina, Mexico have all liberalized abortion laws in recent years. And there have been over 20 countries on the African continent that have also liberalized their national reproductive health policies since the 90s. So I think young professionals entering the field should view this as a time of reflection. If you're based in the US, a time for the US to listen and learn from the successes like that of what's called the Green Movement in Latin America, or the implementation of something called the Maputo Protocol across Africa, and to also keep the long game in mind, because we came so far just making it to Roe v. Wade in the 70s, and I feel like, that's the best that we could do at the time, and we had Roe for 50 years. But quite frankly, you'll hear over and over again in the reproductive health community that Roe was a weak precedent for women to start with. And so we have to see this, emerging public health professionals have to see this as an opportunity to create something stronger and more permanent that explicitly protects women's rights for the long haul.
Yeah. Pari, anything you want to add to that?
I think it was Obama and also my dad who said that the pendulum always swings back. Yes. And I think that's a good reminder for folks in our field. And, that even in times where it just feels like it's untenable, there isn't really change coming, there isn't progress being made, we have to remember and remind ourselves that the United States is no longer the global leader when it comes to women's reproductive health. And so as Eve mentioned, it's time for us to step back and acknowledge that actually there's a lot of other places that are doing it much better than we are, and we should be trying to emulate that as opposed to pushing our policies. And also just a reminder that, every generation that comes is more empathetic than the last. And I can't say that will always be true. I don't know how the world will change, but I want to believe that as a group, humanity is becoming a more empathetic group. And so the more that women talk about their issues, the more that we share, the more that men walk into these spaces with open minds and open hearts, the more we're going to be able to reach a place where, reproductive health is just a given, and it's not even something that needs to be talked about because it's just so normal and expected and part of society.
Yeah. Where can our listeners learn more about you and the work that you're both doing?
We are on Instagram and TikTok. Our handle is @Gemma_talks. Gemma is GEMMA, and talks is TALKS.
Wonderful. Pari, Eve, I cannot thank you enough. This was informative, educational, and such needed discussion to really normalize this in all of our circles. For our listeners, we will have links for how to get a hold of Pari and Eve in the show notes, and we'll see you back here next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to Women Igniting Change. I know creating change matters to you. If you enjoy what we talk about on the show, please take one action today and share it with someone who could benefit from listening. Until next time, keep standing up and speaking out for what matters.